stock, COVID-19, the Delta variant that has been, once again, now a focal point for investors. Unfortunately, virus talk is back. So for that, let's get back to the team at Exanta Data. Joining us, Amelia Bourdeau is an advisor at the firm. Amelia, let's try again. We were going to have a discussion earlier this week. We ran into some internet problems, so thanks for coming back to us.
Thanks for inviting me back. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So let's start by looking at where this is around the world. Where's the focal point? Where right now is it the biggest threat, the Delta variant?
The biggest threat around the world, here's our chart. The biggest threat around the world, I think these are two different questions, would be in the emerging market countries, most of which are under-vaccinated due to lack of vaccine supply. So we've written about this. Our founder, Jens Norvig, has written a public letter on this. We call it the reverse cliff. And that effect is developed countries exporting vaccines to EM, which will start to kick in the third quarter. And so they'll have an oncoming surge of vaccine supply. They can vaccinate their populations and hopefully get that Delta variant or any other variant that unfortunately could pop up under control. So you're kind of seeing a separation now globally where we're in a new COVID phase. So countries that had vaccine supply and aggressively rolled them out, like say here in the United States, there's very limited tolerance and maybe no need to have more restrictions and, certainly closings like for retail and restaurants like we experienced last year. But in kind of the EM countries where the vaccinations haven't been as aggressively rolled out due to kind of limited supply, we will probably continue to see restrictions there for the next 3 to 6 months.
So what's interesting is I really like the way you guys have paired this, the week-over-week change in new cases versus where that sits compared to the worst of the crisis. Clearly, we're very low at the very low end of this, so relative to the worst of last year, relative to the peak. But we are starting to pick up a pretty big pace here in terms of cases for the U.S. down there on the bottom right. And what do we expect, Amelia, in terms of how this translates into hospitalizations or deaths? Do we know yet?
We have seen the cases have been rising in the United States, but it's from very low levels. And we don't have a big and sustained spike yet in the U.S. We have just under 50% of the population fully vaccinated in the U.S. and a little over 55% with at least one shot of the vaccine. And so academic studies have all shown that the vaccines are very effective against protection against the variant, the Delta variant, and also hospitalizations and fatalities, as you said. So the fatalities are quite low, and the hospitalizations are very low in the U.S. too. So even though we have a little bit of a rise in cases from low levels, we have very low hospitalizations and low fatalities, which is great. It shows we think that the vaccines are working. So that's definitely good news. There's a handful of states that are having, a little bit more pressure in terms of the case rise than others, and they coincide with lower vaccination rates. There's a little bit of a problem in, say, Missouri, Arkansas. But we just have to watch to see how this develops. There is no sustained Delta spike here yet in the United States, which is good news.
That is good news. So with a little tick up there on the bottom right for cases, nothing for fatalities yet. And how much, what do we know from last time around in terms of like that transmission timeline from cases to hospitalizations or deaths? Is there a certain point over the coming month we could say, okay, we're in the clear, these vaccinations and the overall rate of vaccination worked? Like, do we have a timeline we can work off here to try and figure out when we'll have firm answers?
It becomes a little bit difficult when you look at it that way. We look at maybe fatalities now independently, say, of testing, because what tends to happen is now in these later stages of the pandemic here in the U.S. at least, they're only testing people who are sick, or people who go to the hospital. So, that can kind of get a bit jumbled. So if we watch fatalities and hospitalizations on their own, I think that's a little bit better, cleaner read of the data. And as I said, they do remain low. If we turn to the UK, which is important because the UK has had the Delta variant the longest. We have the most and longest data set on the UK. And even though they did have a rise in cases, they do have a very low hospitalizations, and the rise in the cases there are mostly in the younger population, which is unvaccinated at this point. So that's good news as well, that the UK has had this the longest and that their hospitalizations and fatalities are quite low still.
Okay, so not only are those numbers low, but also, as you mentioned, the young unvaxxed, we at least understand, right, what's happening here. It's fairly predictable in nature. Right. Amelia, to kind of wrap it up for investors, is there any house view that your team at Exanta has on what role this has been playing in the market the last month and a half, as it's been kind of this insidious story?
Yes, so we do believe that it's kind of dampened growth expectations going forward, or there's a worry about growth expectations going forward. And that's also combined with the Federal Reserve's kind of language change since the June FOMC meeting, where they hinted that they were going to start tapering. And so less tolerance for the overshoot of the 2% inflation target. And combined with the Delta variant and the growth worries coming from that, the back end of the yield curve, I know is a little bit up today, but generally it's fallen since mid-June, and you are seeing the worry about growth, and you're also seeing the U.S. dollar stronger, both on growth concerns and Fed possibly hiking rates sooner than the market had anticipated. So we do believe that right now this is supporting the dollar and is weighing on the back end of the yield curve.
Great stuff, Amelia. Great to catch up. Glad we can make it work. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for your time. Thanks.
Absolutely. Anytime. Amelia Bourdeau is advisor at Exanta Data.